At 0615 on a damp July morning in 1943, Michael Arath approached his aircraft. The B-17, known as Tanlio, sat on the mist-covered runway of RAF Kimballton. At 24 years old, Arath carried the weight of 12 brutal combat missions. He climbed to war at the tail, prepared for a 500-mile journey into the heart of Germany. The tail gunner's compartment was a cramped cage of plexiglass and cold aluminum. Measuring only 4 feet wide, it offered no room for comfort or error. Arath settled onto the small bicycle seat that served as his lonely workstation. Outside, the gray English dawn began to break over the waiting bomber stream. 2 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns pointed like fingers into the empty sky. They were Arath's only companions in a space separated from the crew by 40 feet. The fuselage felt like a fragile tunnel of metal between him and the abyss. No one could talk to him, and no one could help if the worst occurred. At 25,000 feet, the world outside becomes a lethal, frozen wasteland of blue. Temperatures plummet to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, turning breath into ice and skin into stone. Arath checked the wires of his electrically heated suit with meticulous care. That thin layer of warmth was the only thing standing between life and hypothermia. The 8th Air Force called this the loneliest job in the entire global war. The tail gunner was the first to see the enemy and the first to die. Statistics in 1943 were a grim tally of broken planes and missing men. The average crew survived only 11 missions before their luck finally ran dry. German fighter pilots were masters of geometry and the lethal art of the hunt. They preferred the rear attack, diving from the 6 o'clock position with fury. The tail gunner acted as the shield, absorbing the first hail of lead and steel. By July, Arath's bombardment group had already lost 90 men to the clouds. A Messerschmitt closing at 350 miles per hour presented a terrifying problem. The German pilot had a 10-second window to aim and shred the bomber's tail. Arath had the same 10 seconds to hit a target moving at a combined 600 miles per hour. In this high-speed duel, the man who fired accurately first was the only survivor. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried a terrifying array of cannons and heavy machine guns. A single well-placed burst could vaporize the plexiglass and kill the gunner instantly. Without a tail gunner, a B-17 became a helpless whale for the wolves to feast on. Fighters would simply circle back and finish the kill without any resistance. Army Air Force doctrine taught gunners to be patient and conserve their limited ammo. The manual insisted that gunners hold their fire until the enemy reached 300 yards. In a quiet classroom, this theory of discipline seemed perfectly logical and sound. In the screaming chaos of combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already hitting you. Arath had seen the failure of doctrine with his own eyes on his 6th mission. A nearby B-17 took a direct hit to the tail before the gunner could even react. The fighter came in fast, guns blazing, punching through the glass like paper. 8 parachutes emerged from the falling wreck, but the tail gunner was not there. Official doctrine demanded patience, but Arath began to question every word of it. The Luftwaffe pilots exploited the American training manuals like a predictable map. They attacked from maximum range because they knew the Americans would hold fire. Arath decided that if the manual was getting men killed, he would rewrite it himself. On July 30th, 186 bombers lifted off, shaking the English ground with their roar. A small escort of P-47 Thunderbolts flew alongside them to provide temporary safety. Arath knew the arithmetic of fuel meant the escorts would soon have to turn back. Once they reached Belgium, the bombers would be forced to navigate the gauntlet alone. Arath checked his ammunition belts, feeling the heavy weight of the brass rounds. Standard issue was 800 rounds, split between 2 Hungary rapid-fire guns. The manual said this was enough, but Arath had already decided the manual was wrong. By noon, he would find out if his rebellion would save him or lead to his end. The cost of being wrong was a closed casket and a telegram to a grieving family. He watched the English Channel recede through his smudged plexiglass window. The white cliffs of Dover became a thin, pale line on the disappearing horizon. Ahead lay the occupied lands of France, Belgium, and the heart of the Third Reich. The P-47 escorts held their positions like watchful hawks around the formation. Their presence brought a sense of security, but the clock was ticking against them. The Thunderbolts had fuel for 90 minutes of fighting. The mission lasted 6 hours. For the majority of the trip, Aerith would be the only line of defense at the rear. Aerith recalled his first missions, where he followed the training instructions to the letter. He had waited for the fighters to close, aiming carefully for short, disciplined bursts. Instructors had drilled the importance of accuracy over volume into every student. They assumed the enemy would cooperate with the rules of the engagement. The Luftwaffe did not cooperate. They studied American tactics to find every hole. They knew the Americans waited for 300 yards, so they opened fire at 600. They poured cannon shells into the formation while the gunners held their triggers. By the time the Americans fired back, the bombers were already trailing black smoke. Aerith calculated the problem of a Focke-Wulf approaching from the distant rear. At 600 yards, a fighter was flying straight toward him, nose on and vulnerable. It presented the largest possible profile for a gunner to strike and disrupt. The closure rate meant the target's size doubled every few seconds of the approach. A gunner who started early could walk his tracers onto the target with precision. He could adjust his aim as the range decreased, forcing the pilot to break away. The only risk was the ammunition count, which could disappear in a flash of fire. 800 rounds sounded like plenty until 20 separate fighters began their attack. At 50 rounds per burst, the mathematics of the mission turned brutal and fast. A gunner firing early might run dry before the bombers even reached the target. Aerith accepted this trade-off, preferring a dry gun to a dead man in the seat. Survival required disrupting the enemy's attack before the cannons began to bark. Dead men had no use for reserve ammunition or the rules written in training books. Aruth's first real test came in June during a raid on the pins at St. Nazaire. 2 Messerschmitts approached from the 6 o'clock low, the classic lethal angle. Standard doctrine screamed to wait, but Aruth felt his finger tighten on the steel. Aerith opened fire at 700 yards, much to the surprise of the approaching Germans. The tracers arched across the sky, initially falling short before finding their mark. The lead pilot saw the wall of lead and broke his attack in a panicked dive. His wingman followed, and neither fighter managed to score a single hit on Tanlio. Back on the ground, the crew chief questioned Aerith about his high ammunition use. The logs showed he had expended 200 rounds on a single long-range engagement. The chief was skeptical, warning that he would run out deep inside German air. Aerith stood his ground, explaining that the fighters never got close enough to fire. Other tail gunners in the squadron heard the story and called Aruth's actions reckless. Wasting precious ammunition on long shots violated every rule the Air Force taught. They argued that the manuals existed for a reason, and he was gambling with lives. Yet while others were lost, the Tanlio kept returning home with its crew intact. The 527th Squadron was suffering, losing 3 bombers in a single bloody month. 30 men were gone, leaving empty bunks and a heavy silence in the barracks. Now, crossing into Belgium on July 30th, the escort fighters began to waggle wings. Fuel gauges demanded their retreat, leaving the bombers to face the coming storm. Somewhere ahead, 300 German fighters were fueled and climbing to intercept. Arath knew he would need every single round tucked into his metal ammo cans. He also knew he had to survive long enough to pull the triggers when it mattered. The first signs of the enemy appeared at 11:42 as dots against the horizon. The Messerschmitts climbed from the southeast, organized in disciplined groups of 4. Arath counted them until he reached 12, then stopped as the sky filled with black. The sky behind Tandlio was suddenly crowded with yellow noses and iron crosses. The lead fighter began its run from the 6 o'clock high, diving at 400 miles per hour. Arath tracked the diving plane through his sights, his heart drumming against his ribs. The wingspan grew larger with every passing second as the range closed rapidly. At 800 yards far beyond the recommended limit, he squeezed both heavy triggers. The twin Brownings roared, shaking the tail and sending a stream of fire outward. The first rounds fell short, disappearing into the cold air below the diving enemy. Arath adjusted his aim instantly, walking the fire upward toward the pilot's path. At 600 yards, the tracers began to spark and flash along the fighter's engine cowling. The German pilot broke hard to the right, smoke trailing from his damaged machine. The fighter spiraled downward, disappearing into the thick cloud layer far below. Arath had no time to celebrate or even breathe before the next threat emerged. A second attacker was closing fast, trying to slip beneath the gunner's field of fire. The angle was steep and difficult, forcing Arath to depress his guns to the limit. He fired a long burst anyway, sending a message of lead to the approaching pilot. The Focke-Wulf pilot flinched, pulling up early and spraying cannons into empty air. The attack on the formation continued for 47 minutes of unrelenting high-speed terror. Wave after wave of fighters slashed through the combat box, seeking the weak. Arath fired at everything that moved, burning through ammo at a staggering rate. His gun barrels began to glow a dull red from the heat of sustained heavy fire. At 12:29, a Messerschmitt approached directly from the rear, flying straight and level. Pilot seemed determined, showing either extraordinary courage or fatal judgment. Arath centered the target in his crosshairs and held the triggers down firmly. The Brownings hammered for 6 continuous seconds, a symphony of destruction. Over 100 rounds poured into the German aircraft, tearing through its metal skin. The Messerschmitt disintegrated, its engine separating from the broken fuselage. The wings folded backward as the remains of the plane tumbled past the Tandlio. It was close enough for Arath to see the empty, shattered cockpit through the smoke. The pilot was gone, and Arath had secured his second confirmed kill of the day. His ammunition counter was dropping fast, now down to only 180 remaining rounds. The formation reached Kassel at 12:51 and began the tension-filled bombing run. For 11 minutes, the planes had to fly straight and level, unable to dodge. The Luftwaffe knew this was the moment of maximum vulnerability for the B-17s. They pressed their attacks with a renewed, desperate fury to stop the bombs. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tandlio from the 5 o'clock position, with guns blazing. Arath swung his heavy weapons to meet it, firing a short, desperate burst of lead. The rounds struck the fighter's wing, but the pilot refused to break his deadly run. Cannon shells tore through Tandlio's tail, and Arath felt the impact in his soul. 20mm fragments ripped through the plexiglass, shredding Arath's flight suit. Metal buried itself in his left arm and shoulder, painting the compartment red. His left gun jammed as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cramped, cold space. He was wounded and half-blinded, but he refused to let go of the right trigger. One-handed and bleeding, he tracked the wounded Focke-Wulf as it tried to pull away. A final burst caught the fighter's tail assembly, sending it into a violent snap roll. The aircraft dove toward the earth, marking Arath's third kill of the long mission. The intercom crackled with frantic voices asking about damage and checking on crew. Arath tried to respond to his pilot, but his throat had gone dry from the adrenaline. Blood pooled on the floor, freezing into dark ice in the sub-zero mountain air. He had 400 rounds expended, 63 remaining, and 3 German fighters destroyed. The mission was only half over, and the return journey promised more blood. Tandlio still had to fly 250 miles back to the safety of the English coast.
Oh.
They would face the same gauntlet of fighters that had nearly killed them before. Aerith wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm to slow the flow of his blood. He waited in the silence of the tail, watching for the next shadow in the clouds. The return flight began at 13:04 as the bombers left Kassel, burning behind them. A massive column of black smoke rose into the sky, a testament to their grim work. Aerith scanned the horizon through blood-smeared glass, his vision tunneling. The Luftwaffe was regrouping over Belgium, waiting for the exhausted crews. Fresh German aircraft replaced those lost in the morning's chaotic aerial battles. The second gauntlet was poised to be just as dangerous as the first encounter. Aruth's left arm had gone completely numb from the combination of cold and steel. His jammed gun was useless, its mechanism shattered by a German cannon shell. He had one functioning weapon and exactly 63 rounds to cover the hostile airspace. The mathematics of survival demanded a completely different surgical approach. He could afford only 3 short engagements of roughly 20 rounds each. Every single trigger pull had to be a masterpiece of timing and cold-blooded aim. At 13:31, a pair of Messerschmitts closed in from the 7 o'clock position. Aerith showed ice in his veins, waiting until they reached 500 yards to fire. He let loose a precise 12-round burst that struck the lead fighter's engine. The plane rolled, inverted, and dove away, trailing a stream of glycol coolant. The wingman saw his leader's fate and decided to break off without attacking. Aerith checked his count. 51 rounds remained to defend against an entire air force. The formation crossed back into France at 14:15, the sun beginning to dip. The fighter attacks finally diminished as the Germans reached their fuel limits. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later, a silver hope. The landing at Kimbleton at 15:52 was a jar of reality for the battered crew. Aerith was so weak he could not climb out of his compartment without help. Ground crews pulled him through the hatch and rushed him to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon counted 11 separate fragment wounds in Aruth's tired body. Word of the tail gunner's stand spread through the bombardment group like wildfire. He had scored 3 kills while wounded, using a single gun and a handful of ammo. The intelligence report noted his early engagement technique as a key to survival. Other tail gunners in the squadron began to visit Aerith to ask about his methods. The standard doctrine said to wait for 300 yards, but Aerith had fired at 800. The doctrine said conserve, but Aerith had burned through 700 rounds to stay alive. It was becoming clear that the old rules produced dead men, but Aerith was breathing. The gunnery officer reviewed the combat footage captured by Tandlio's cameras. The film showed tracers reaching out far beyond the normal accepted range. These long-range shots were disrupting attack runs before pilots could aim. The early fire forced the enemy to maneuver, degrading their lethal accuracy. By mid-August, 3 other gunners had adopted Aruth's aggressive style. Their survival rates improved immediately, and their bombers returned less damaged. The correlation was impossible for the high command to ignore any longer. The group commander received a report suggesting a total overhaul of defense. Meanwhile, Arath recovered in the hospital, his wounds healing in the quiet. The fragments had luckily missed major vessels, allowing for a swift recovery. Was cleared for duty on August 19th, only 3 weeks after the Kassel raid. As the old Tandlio was too damaged to fly. The replacement plane carried the same name and the same battle-hardened crew. Aerith climbed back into his tail position on August 26th, ready for the sky. The Luftwaffe had also noticed the change in American defensive patterns. Their intelligence officers were already studying how to counter the early fire. German pilots reported that the 6 o'clock was no longer a safe angle. Tracers were reaching them before they could even establish a firing platform. The psychological effect of long-range fire was causing pilots to flinch early. Even if the rounds missed, the fear of the lead wall forced a defensive break. The Luftwaffe responded by increasing their approach speeds to maximum velocity. They shifted their angles to the high 6 o'clock to use gravity's heavy assist. They even tried targeting the most aggressive gunners to eliminate the threat. But none of these adaptations could solve the problem of Aruth's long-range wall. Aruth flew for more missions in early September, adding 2 more kills to his belt. The loss ratio for the German fighters against his squadron was climbing high. German commanders began concentrating their attacks to overwhelm the gunners. This new tactic proved deadly for other groups, but Aruth's group held firm. The air war had become a chess match of innovation and deadly counter-moves. Aruth understood that his edge would disappear once the enemy fully adapted. Every mission was a test of nerves, and every engagement was a data point. The temporary advantage provided by his aggression was eroding with time. A mission to Stuttgart was scheduled for September 6th, deep in the south. This was the longest penetration attempted by the 8th Air Force that month. Stuttgart was a fortress of flak and fighters, protecting vital ball-bearing plants. The strategic importance of the target meant the defense would be fanatical. The 379th was assigned the lead position, a place of honor and extreme danger. Lead position meant they would be the first to face every fighter in the sector. Aruth prepared his guns on the evening of the 5th, checking every spring, loaded 1,200 rounds this time, ignoring the weight for the sake of power. The Stuttgart mission launched into an overcast sky at 5:40 the next morning. 187 bombers climbed through the clouds, forming a massive vibrating wall. Tanlio flew at the very front, where Aruth would see the first of the enemy. The fighters intercepted them over France at 9:15, rising from hidden fields. The initial attacks were head-on, testing the nerves of the men in the nose. Aruth watched the contrails multiply behind them, a sign of the gathering storm. Over 100 interceptors were now tracking the formation, waiting for their turn. The rear attacks began at 10:08 with a disciplined staffel of 12 fighters. Aruth opened fire at 700 yards, his tracers cutting through the thin, cold air. One fighter took multiple hits and fell away, trailing a long ribbon of smoke. The remaining 9 pressed on, their cannons ripping through the B-17's skin. The bomber on Tanlio's wing took a hit to an engine and began to slip back. Aruth kept firing, his eyes darting between targets as they flashed in his view. His ammunition counter dropped, 600, 500, then 400 rounds left in the cans. 10:31, a Focke-Wulf dove from the sun, catching Aruth by total surprise. Cannon shells smashed into the tail, throwing Aruth against the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed instantly, its receiver shattered into useless shards. Fragments tore into his scalp and arms, and blood began to cloud his vision. He wiped the red from his eyes and grabbed the right gun with a scream. The Focke-Wulf pulled away smoking, but Tanlio was now a dying bird. Cannon fire had severed the hydraulic lines and punctured the heavy wing tanks. The pilots fought the controls, but the bomber was losing its fight with gravity. They reached Stuttgart at 11:04 and managed to release their bombs on target. Then, Tanlio fell out of formation, unable to keep up with the healthy planes. The pilots realized they would never see the green fields of England today. The best option was to ditch in the channel and hope for a fast rescue. Aruth stayed at his post during the long descent, watching for any pursuers. None came as the Luftwaffe was busy with the main body of the formation. Tanlio hit the gray water of the channel at 120 miles per hour with a crash. The fuselage broke and Aruth's head slammed into the cold steel gun mount. Darkness claimed him as the remains of the bomber sank into the salty depths. He woke up in a life raft, the salt spray stinging his many open wounds. All 10 crew members survived the crash, a miracle in the middle of the sea. The Distinguished Service Cross was awarded to Aruth for his heroic actions. The Citation praised his decision to fire while wounded to protect his brothers. The Air Force staff began a deep analysis of the data from his last missions. The conclusions challenged a year of established, rigid American air doctrine. Tail gunners who engaged at long range had much higher rates of survival. The early fire was the key to breaking the spirit and aim of the German pilots. Aggressive fire was officially recognized as the superior way to defend the fleet. In November, the policy was changed for every bomber group in the theater. Aruth's rebellion had become the law of the sky for thousands of young men. However, Aruth would never see the full effect of his tactical revolution. His head injuries were severe, and the flight surgeons grounded him for good. His final tally was 17 confirmed kills, a record few could ever hope to match. He had earned more decorations than most pilots ever saw in their entire careers. The Distinguished Flying Cross and the Purple Heart sat in his quiet locker. His war was over, but his influence was just beginning to save other lives. Aruth was sent home in 1944 to teach new gunners his hard-won secrets. He passed his experience to men who would fly over Germany and Japan. His students carried his methods into every theater of the global conflict. He taught them to ignore the old books and trust the reality of the metal. When the war ended, Aruth did not return to a simple, quiet civilian life. He joined the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 to keep serving. He remained in uniform until 1962, retiring as a respected master sergeant. He had seen enough combat for 10 lifetimes, but he found purpose in the service. The Air Force had given him a reason to survive during the world's darkest hour. Walking away felt like abandoning the men who still flew in the dangerous skies. His post-war years were spent in the quiet shadows of a normal, humble life. He married and raised a family, rarely speaking of the fire he had seen. His medals stayed in a drawer, and the memories stayed locked in his mind. Like many of his generation, he felt that words could never bridge the gap. Elmer Bendener, his navigator, eventually wrote a memoir about their time. The book ensured that the story of the Tandalia would live on for decades. Aruth attended reunions when he could, seeing the faces of the survivors, remembered the friends who didn't come home and the luck they shared. Michael Aruth passed away in 1990 at the age of 70 in Florida. He was buried in the National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona with full honors. His headstone is simple, listing only his rank and his years of faithful service. It doesn't mention the 17 planes he downed or the lives he saved. Military cemeteries are places of quiet understatement and heavy hidden history. The stones mark the names, but they cannot hold the weight of the courage. Aruth lies among thousands of others, each with a story that deserves a voice. We rescue these forgotten stories from the dusty archives every single day. Stories of tail gunners who used innovation to shield their crews from death. Real people who faced impossible odds and decided to change the rules. Drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or perhaps Australia? Q.R community stretches across the globe, united by a love for this history. You are not just a viewer. You are a keeper of these important memories. Tell us if someone in your family served in the air or on the ground. Let us know you are here and that these stories still matter to you today. Thank you for watching and for making sure Michael Aruth is never forgotten. These men deserve to be remembered, and your support makes that possible. We will continue to bring these stories to light so they never fade away. The courage of the few protected the freedom of the many in the dark skies. Michael Arath was a rebel in the tale, and his legacy lives on in us. Until next time, keep the history alive and honor those who flew before.